Mr. Nixon, what is the truth about our ability to fight the growing menace of communism?
Well, first, we must recognize communism for what it is. Mr. Khrushchev understands only strength and firmness. To apologize to him just means weakness. Our next president must show clearly that America won't stand for being pushed around anywhere in the world. When Mr. Khrushchev says our grandchildren will live under communism, we must answer his grandchildren will live in freedom. When he says the Monroe Doctrine is dead, we say the doctrine of freedom applies everywhere in the world. The only answer to communism is a massive offensive for freedom. Freedom from hunger, from disease, and a victory for the ageless hope of people everywhere. Freedom from tyranny.
Vote for Nixon and Lodge, November 8th.
The Cold War, a conflict between ideologies, nuclear powers, the nuclear family, the Red Scare, the US, and the USSR. In Western media, the Cold War was described just like that, the main two forces at each other's throats, threatening with atom bombs and instilling fear in their populations. So let's see what the media forgets to tell you, how this shaped the world stage of global politics, the hegemony of the USA, and capitalism as the governing economic system. After World War II, the US emerged as the main world superpower. The USSR was struggling, considering that before the Red Army reached Berlin, around 27 million Soviet citizens were killed. But this meant that after World War II, the USSR needed time to stabilize, while the US lost around 410,000 soldiers. This gave the United States the time and power to expand their influence, well, all over the world. So immediately after World War II, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, a wartime agency tasked with collecting intelligence behind enemy lines, was terminated. And in its place, President Harry Truman created the CIG, the Central Intelligence Group, which is the direct predecessor to the strongest terrorist organization in the world, the Central Intelligence Agency. But why do I say that the CIA is the strongest terrorist organization? Let's just say that deserves a video on its own. But for this one, we will dive in the surface of covert operations of the agency. For starters, even after World War II, the CIA started working really hard in Western Europe. They were preparing for a potential invasion from the USSR, which it never happened. But nevertheless, in 1952, CIA, in coordination with the MI6 and Western Union countries, formed Operation Gladio. This operation was known under many names in all countries, but the agencies that were recruiting anti-communist soldiers, they were training them in guerrilla tactics and sabotage in CIA and MI6 controlled bases. The agencies did not mind employing among moderate conservatives right-wing extremists and neo-fascist terrorists such as
Stefano Delle Chiaie,
Yves Guérin-Seurat,
who went on to kidnap, torture, and murder leftist organizers and politicians around the world, including false flag terrorist attacks that were blamed on the communist parties of Europe. An infamous example of these attacks organized by the right-wing extremist groups in order to discredit left-wing parties around Western Europe was the Piazza Fontana bombing in 1969 in Milan, where they killed 17 people and wounded 88. The bombing was of course blamed on Italian anarchists. Italian journalists who investigated the attack even decades later found that the New Order terrorists, they were a group of far-right extremists, were receiving funding from the US Embassy in Rome, and that the CIA supplied materials and covered their tracks during the investigation. In the Eastern Bloc, the CIA used ex-Nazi collaborators that were parachuted into Soviet territory starting in 1949 to gather intel, destabilize the newly formed governments, and support anti-communist groups. All of the agents were captured, tortured, and killed. This is how the CIA found out that Soviet territory would be very difficult to penetrate. And because they really wanted to fight communism, well, the third world, baby. That was the place to do it. Now, the US was the greatest superpower of the time, so it had the freedom to do pretty much whatever it wanted in the fight against communism. So let's talk about several examples. At the time, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who, when taken over, initiated several land reforms, social programs, and the nationalization of the oil industry. Big mistake. So the CIA collaborated with MI6, who had corporate interests from BP, or the Anglo-Persian Oil Company as it was known then in Iran, to draft a plan called Operation Ajax. So with the help of the Iranian Shah, the royal family basically, and General Zahedi, they managed to overthrow the elected Mossadegh and proceeded to reinstate the Shah as the supreme leader of the country. Mossadegh was not a communist, but the Tudeh party of Iran, the Communist Party, supported his reforms, and he was branded with communist affinities by the Western powers. The CIA created pamphlets and posters proclaiming that Mossadegh was a communist, the enemy of Islam. They paid off journalists to write that he was a Jew. The CIA hired gangsters to pretend to be Tudeh party members and attack a mosque. Following the coup, organized protests became violent after CIA and MI6 supported extremist groups to infiltrate the protests and turn them violent. Between 200 and 300 people died. The Shah was appointed by the US and the UK as king of Iran, and he continued to sell Iran's natural resources, oil, for extremely low prices while also running an oppressive dictatorship. This was named Operation PB Success. Jacobo Arbenz was the newly elected president of Guatemala in 1951. He was praised as a man of the people because of his administration's reforms. The most significant was an agrarian reform that directly clashed with the US company United Fruit, which owned more than 40% of the nation's arable land. His reforms tried to expropriate very wealthy landowners and give them back to the peasants, who are 90% of the population. What's pretty interesting to note is that the government willingly compensated wealthy owners of lands, but in the eyes of the United Fruit Company, who understated the value of the land to reduce their taxes, the compensation was not enough. The powerful lobby of the United Fruit Company and the Eisenhower administration, who thought that Arbenz's administration was becoming too communist in their backyard, started a smearing campaign against Arbenz. The truth is, Arbenz was working with the Communist Party of Guatemala. They supported his land, tax, and social reforms, who were tangibly improving the lives of all Guatemalans. During this, the CIA funded and trained a group of Guatemalan exiles in Honduras, who were led by Carlos Castillo Armas. On the 18th of June in 1954, the militia group invades Guatemala, and although they were losing the rebellion, their propaganda tools, sponsored by the CIA, succeeded in making the Guatemalan army believe the US would invade, and they surrendered their arms. On the 27th of June, Jacobo Arbenz resigned, and 10 days later, Armas was named president. What happened next will shock you, because whenever the CIA overthrows a government, they will never put in place a ruthless dictator. Armas banned opposition parties and became a brutal dictator, murdering tens of thousands of communists, suspected communists, and genocided the indigenous population of the Maya peoples. The civil war that ensued consisted of US-backed dictators fighting against leftist guerrilla militias. This lasted for almost 4 decades and is estimated to have killed around 200,000 civilians. One very famous quote that originates from this tragic event is from the leader of the Guatemalan Communist Party, the BGT, Mario Vargas. They would have overthrown us even if we had grown no bananas. And that is absolutely true. The US could never allow a country in Central America to even slightly think about their interests and slide to the left because of this thing that US politicians thought would happen as a domino effect. For example, Guatemala nationalizes their resources and turns to their population with policies that improve their lives, or in the heads of US politicians, instantly turns communist. And following their example, other countries in Latin America follow suit, which is unacceptable because that brings them closer to the Soviet Union than to the US, and we all know that is very, very dangerous. But let me tell you something more. During the Guatemalan coup, there was a certain character there. A young 25-year-old Argentinian doctor, right in the capital, Guatemala City. His name was Ernesto Guevara, and what he saw during that time shaped his ideas and actions of what was to come to Cuba. So that brings us to Cuba in 1961, which is a very interesting event, and to understand what happened, and most importantly, why it happened, we must look before the Cold War. So Cuba was a Spanish colony until 1898, when the US won the Spanish-American War and received several colonies of Spain, which were Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Also the Philippines, which the US bought. So after this conflict, Cuba became a treasure for the US, the perfect vacation spot for Americans, and heavily invested in their infrastructure, built lavish hotels, resorts, and casinos. All of this happened while Cuban farms and US companies exported millions of tons of sugar, which at the time was a valuable commodity, and their main customer was the US. The high price of sugar made business and farm owners applied for loans at US banks, and when the boom of sugar collapsed, many of these companies filed for bankruptcy. During this time, the leaders of the Cuban political class were accused of corruption due to their close proximity to capital and foreign, especially American, investment companies, while their population was struggling due to the recent financial crisis. As the result of the election of 1924 and pressure from the population, the leadership changed slightly, and not for the better. Candidate Gerardo Machado was elected president. Many people, especially the middle class, supported him and thought a businessman was a good alternative for president, which sounds kind of familiar, right? During his first term, many public project works were started. However, the population accused him of using public funds for getting rich. Despite a lot of criticism and rejection from the youth and professionals, he was re-elected in 1928 and began even more authoritarian. The population's situation was getting even worse, with the Great Depression slowly creeping into Cuba. Protests of Machado's government were organized, and under the pretext of crisis, martial law was proclaimed, suspension of constitutional guarantees, people's rights, and heavy censorship on press and political opponents. The US tried to mediate the conflict between Machado and the opposition. However, a general strike of the Cuban people was called, the army betrayed Machado, and finally, on 12th of August 1933, he was forced into exile. What I just told you is very relevant for the context of the Batista dictatorship and the Cuban inheritance of repressive political practices which the Spanish used for 4 centuries of colonial rule. Now let's get to one of our main guys, Fulgencio Batista, the most ruthless dictator Cuba has seen. In 1933, there was the Sergeants' Revolt, which Batista was part of, in which the army betrayed Machado. And for his contributions in the revolt, Batista became the most powerful man in Cuba and its leader, although in the first 7 years he ruled through associates. During this time, Batista became very, very rich, and he supported works on education, infrastructure, and the growth of the economy, which got him elected in 1940 as president of Cuba. His first term was characterized by corruption and a close relationship with the Allies during World War II. After his term ended, he moved to Florida to invest his wealth. Batista returned to Cuba in 1952 and tried to run for president again, and understandably, the population would not elect him again on his charges of wide-scale corruption, but with the backing of the US government and the army, he led a coup to take down the president of the time and established his dictatorship. He immediately suspended the 1940 Cuban constitution, which he implemented, and started attacking civil rights such as the right to protest. Because of the support he received from the US, Batista represented the interests of the wealthy landowners and American corporations, which created even more social instability as the wealth gap was growing. Batista worked with the American mafia, which was controlling the gambling, prostitution, drug industries, and used his anti-communist secret police to shut down student protests, kidnap, torture, and murder alleged communists, or just people openly and loudly criticizing his rule. It is estimated that the death toll during the 1952-1958 dictatorship of Batista reached around 20,000 victims. The rebel forces of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who led a 2-year-long revolt against the regime using guerrilla warfare tactics, finally defeated Batista's forces on the 31st of December 1958, and the dictator resigned on the 1st of January, fleeing to the Dominican Republic. So that was the Cuban Revolution, and you would think that the US would acknowledge the new administration as better for the people of Cuba. Well, during the previous administrations on Cuba, wealthy Americans and business owners invested in their colonial vacation spot, and Castro's communism would not allow foreign capital to reign supreme on the island. So in 1960, the Department of State issued a memorandum in which it stated that the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection, based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. In other words, the US thought that Castro would disappear if Cuba would struggle economically. So they put their plan into action. The US would halt any money and supplies to Cuba in order to decrease wages and turn the population against their newly formed government. Cuba, on the other hand, turned to the Soviet Union as an ally to their cause, and this made the US very, very angry. The US reduced their sugar imports from Cuba, refused to export oil to the island, and urged the oil corporations present there, which were Esso and Texaco, to refuse to refine Soviet crude oil. In the same year, 1960, Cuba confiscated the oil refineries, and the US stopped importing sugar altogether. This started the trend of imposing harsh sanctions on the Cuban population. You can start seeing how this all would play out in the future. In August 1960, Cuba nationalizes the US-owned oil refineries, the Cuban Telephone Company, and 36 sugar mills. The US responds by placing a total trade embargo besides humanitarian aid. Cuba further nationalizes all US businesses and offers compensation in Cuban bonds, which were rejected by the wealthy Americans. Then Eisenhower severs all diplomatic relations with Cuba in January 1961. Then we have the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 under Kennedy, which was a total failure of an invasion by the CIA-backed DRF, the counter-revolutionary group, which consisted of exiles after the overthrow of Batista. The CIA supplied training and equipment to the DRF, and the US aided them with aerial bombings of Cuban fields. Castro took personal control of the defense, and President Kennedy decided to withdraw aerial support after the international community found out about the invasion taking place. Without US aerial and naval support, the invasion was defeated and the DRF surrendered, all members being put in prisons. Unfortunately for the US, the failure solidified Castro's position as a national hero and strengthened Cuba-Soviet relations. What followed were more trade sanctions on Cuba, on countries that aided them, and businesses were prohibited to operate in Cuba if they wanted access to the US market. And today, sanctions are still in place. Although Obama tried to warm up their relations, Trump and Biden did no such thing and imposed even more trade restrictions. Despite all this, Cuba has managed to outperform the US in a number of categories, namely healthcare, literacy rates, infant mortality, number of doctors per capita, etc. So how did a tiny island nation manage to outperform the richest nation on the planet in so many areas?
Okay, I'll tell you why I want to destroy Arasaka, but I'll only tell you once.
I have a short answer. Capitalism. The profit incentive of US corporations to make money instead of actually improving living conditions. And there are so many more examples of countries that outperform the US because they care more about their populations than the bastion of the Western civilized world. So the US foreign policy has not changed significantly, and I am afraid I have not done these events enough service. The tragedy is that people from these countries and many more countries have suffered consequences for decades because of US imperialism and their fight against communism. For people in the imperial core, these tragedies were rarely spoken of. Or, if they were even mentioned, a wave of anti-communist rhetoric was mandatory so that no one questioned the legitimacy of US involvement for spreading freedom and democracy. Many of these events were secret until recently, and although analysts were pretty sure of CIA involvement, they were confirmed only decades later. Unfortunately, millions of people have been killed by these ruthless dictators that the US supported due to their common hate for anything left of liberals, so basically the whole left spectrum of politics. I would like to dedicate this video and the start of a series to bring light to past and current events that you do not hear much of, so that you can make your own conclusions and understand the world as it is now. Am I biased? Yes, but my mission is to give you perspective through a material analysis of the past and present. So if I manage to shape your opinion towards politics, why is it so important, and how can you defend yourself, your friends, family, and your community in these turbulent times, then I will call it a success. Thank you everyone for watching. Please like and subscribe if you would like to see future content. My word to you guys is stay safe, spread love, and don't give up. There's always a better tomorrow, but we have to change ourselves today. See ya.